on the cloud. It's already recording. Got it. Thank you.
I just hit it and I'll record onto my computer just because our cloud, we have limited cloud storage, and then I'll make sure to upload it into our drive.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for spending some of your Saturday morning with us. Let me pull up I got a little bit of a slide deck here just to guide our introductions. And some of you are not strangers and have already engaged in this topic with us at the annual gathering. But some I may be overlooked, but maybe are new to this conversation. So today's goal is to, we've kind of introduced the adapted 5 life standards for the healing professions at annual gathering, and there was a publication out in Anabaptist World about them, and we are so excited. Well, I won't let the cat out of the bag yet, but today's goal is to talk about to what are we going to apply these standards and what context of our work and lives, and just to kind of start brainstorming some of these frameworks. And this is all in preparation for a committee to come together. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So as far as an outline for our morning, I don't know if we'll take the full 2 hours, but I hope that we leave enough time, and I'm glad we have enough time set aside for the discussion, because that seems to be the most fruitful time. But I'd like to make sure we have time for introductions, and then a little bit of background. And we are very excited that we have support from the Schowalter Foundation through a grant to implement this project. So I'll share a little bit about that. We'll kind of review briefly some of what was covered in the annual gathering plenary session, the adapted life standards, and then we'll open it up to discussion about the context of our work and lives that we want to work to apply these to. So as far as introductions, I'd love to hear from everybody where they are working or living, and their affiliation to healthcare or their connections to this topic. And then just what has been your exposure or experience with the 5 life standards, or the more with less tradition. And then also, if you're here for a reason, and I actually had to go to the thrift store here locally and find the more, I have that old one, but I was like, I probably should get the updated one too. And it even had a CD in it. So I'm looking forward to figuring out what's in the CD. So all for $1.25, book savers. So you're here because you're interested in this project. So I would love to hear your individual vision and perspective for what you hope for this project to be. We kind of have some of our ideas that we've outlined in the grant, but this is a mutual support initiative of the fellowship. So we want your involvement and vision to be represented. Oh, so let's go ahead and go around here. And so I can start. My name is Lyubov Slasheva. I work and live in Harrisonburg, Virginia at a community health center as a dentist. And I graduated from dental school in 2016, so kind of fresh out after some residency years. And my first exposure experience with the 5 life standards, I attended Eastern Mennonite University for my undergraduate training, and kind of was exposed to the general themes, I guess, of the tradition. And then throughout dental school, kept kind of in touch with the Mennonite faith community, and kind of delved more into my personal kind of interest and ownership of affiliating with the Mennonites and Anabaptist traditions and values. And so got into reading Living More with Less, and some of the online presence with Melinda Berry and others. So that's my kind of late adult, well, your early adulthood, but not childhood experiences that maybe some of you have. And I won't talk too much about my vision because it's reflected in the grant and things that we put together with leadership. Kate or May, would either of you like to share?
Sure.
Go ahead, May.
I can, May, you can start and I'll go after you.
Oh, well, I feel like Kate's already sort of introduced me. I am currently based in Germany, but we're heading back. My residence is in Vermont, Middlebury, Vermont. And I am affiliated with now with MHF and more, I think more connected with GON, the Global Anabaptist Health Network. I am not Mennonite, but I have we did attend a Mennonite church when we lived in Georgia, and I have very good memories of that. When we started, as I started working with Kate and Bob, and we're talking about the 5 life standards, I thought, gee, I don't know what they are. Probably a good idea if I'm supposed to be working on it. So I got myself a copy of this, and I was reading through it, and I liked it so much that I introduced it to our small group at church. And so we're currently going through this as well. Our focus there is not on health professions, but just on applying it in life in general. So by background, I have a training in public health, but I haven't actually worked in public health in the last almost 20 years since my kids came along. But I am, just recently have joined GON and also MHF. So I'm trying to get back into this kind of health, international health, and particularly what I find very interesting is the intersection of faith and health. I think those are 2 things that are very important to me, and I think that's exactly what we're trying to get at, the intersection of how our faith and how we live in our practical world. So thank you.
We're so glad that you're here, May. And Kate, many of you know me through MHF. My background training is as a chaplain. I also hold a degree in public health in epidemiology, and that really has a focus on religion and health. I am the director of MHF, which really is a role where I get to coordinate and draw out the gifts of those within MHF. And that's really the most rewarding piece of it, is seeing the passions of others come through and kind of those sparks of inspiration, which is really how this project came about, was in a conversation. I also, outside of those things, I am a pastor at Germantown Mennonite Church. I do focus on pastoral care there, and some community outreach things. I also continue to do a lot of writing and research in religion and health. So I do work for Rush University Department of Religion, Health, and Human Values, which I think is a cool name. And I'm impressed they even have that department and fund it. And I do research really on the intersection of religion and largely pediatric medicine. And I enjoy getting to do that in my spare time. I don't think other people do qualitative interviews in their spare time, but I just love it. So that's a wonderful piece of what I get to do. I first heard of More with Less when I was a baby Mennonite. I joined the Mennonite Church right after college. And my congregation, Madison Mennonite, gave away the More with Less cookbook. Instead of a Bible to its graduating seniors, and people annotated it and said like, oh, no, this is so much better with 1 cup of sugar and half a cup of applesauce or whatever it was. And so we would like flip through it. And I was like, oh, I was really drawn to the essays at the front of the cookbook. If you have the kind of original spiral bound one, it has those essays. And then I ended up living in the MBS house while I was at seminary. And actually in the new book that Lubov and May have, and I have it, it's just way behind me. There's a little write-up about Jubilee House from when I was living there, which is kind of fun. So I knew this project was happening. And really, I always loved the life standards. Part of my joining the Mennonite Church, I came from an evangelical context. My parents attend an evangelical megachurch. Has been this idea that I love it when the church kind of holds us accountable to standards. I was that teen that wanted standards. I wanted guides for how to live. And I'm so excited to take these and really apply them specifically to healthcare professionals, because it's a really tough time to be a healthcare professional. Healthcare is changing so much that I love this idea of really coming down to these basics and saying, what are the standards by which we strive to live, and how can that be the guide for us? And of course, these standards come out of, our Christian faith. And so I love that sort of stair-step way of looking at things. So thank you very much.
Emily Edwards, I might just call on folks that I see on my list here. Would you like to go next?
Sure. So my name is Emily Schonk Edwards. I'm a family physician in Stanton, Virginia. I've been a physician about 10 years now, and started out in an NFQHC and realized that even the work at the FQHC didn't totally align with what my values were. And so I left that and have started my own practice. I've grown up in the Church of the Brethren faith community. And so I've always been very drawn to you all. And just a little aside that when I was in residency, I became a member, and back when the magazine was printed was where I saw the job advertisement for the first job that I took after residency, which was pretty cool. I've been kind of a lurker in this group since it started, because every time you all would have a conference, it would conflict with other things. But when I saw the email came through about this particular project, I was very intrigued, because I got my first More with Less when I was married. And it's been so loved that it now has its own binder, because I pretty much destroyed the binding that was already there. And as I'm sure all of you have found, guidance and leadership and connection has been much lacking since the pandemic started, and even before, in what medicine was doing. And so finding something that I could really identify with and say, yes, this is something that I can go with, was exciting. So that's why I'm here.
Well, welcome. We're so glad to have you this morning, and look forward to continuing to engage your excitement about this project. Stan Godshaw, would you like to go next, or kind of next on my list?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Stan Godshaw. I'm in the twilight of my life and career, I guess, retired family physician. Grew up really, I was Mennonited all the way up. So this is what you see. And in fact, Bill Swartley and I, who's with us today, sat on the same pew as our fathers led singing at the Franconia Mennonite Church way back in the 40s and 50s. So one thing I had to think about my background, my father actually had a lot of money. I didn't know it because we lived so simply all the time. And I don't know if he was guided by principle or what. When he died, I realized, boy, he has a lot. But it was ingrained in me to not overspend on myself. And when my dad was dying in 1958 of a sepsis, staph sepsis in the hospital, I made a promise to God. And what would you promise God if you want God to heal your father? You know, as a 15-year-old, I promised I'd be a missionary doctor. You know, what's that all about? But that's the upbringing that we had. And then our doctor discovered erythromycin, and that cured him back in 1958. It was penicillin resistant staph. And so he lived to be 98. So anyway, but I really hit the justice. Well, yeah, then in the 70s, we worked through this book when it came out originally, because at the same time I was in a small group with Don Crable, and we were working through his book, The Upside Down Kingdom. So, you know, there's a lot of new stuff coming in my head back then. And then I went to Shirati, and boy, the justice stuff really hit me. There I was, I hardly had any medicine. And back in my hometown in Lancaster County, they're putting a couple $1 million addition to their hospital, and we only have penicillin, you know. And, you know, it just got to the core, because the border to Kenya was closed, and I was the only doctor there. I was treating my family with this kind of care. That's all I had to even to treat my own family there. Anyway, it was really very emotional for me. And I wrote this letter to the head of Lancaster General Hospital, the CEO, and I said, look, you guys have all this stuff. Here, look what we got. Can't you give us a little bit? And he made 3,000 copies of that letter and gave it to all the employees, and they raised a whole bunch of money for Shirati. And so I've been working with helping to support the hospital ever since. Anyway, so those are some of the backgrounds, and I've always been a little wary of investment in bigger and bigger buildings of our office. Even though my partners wanted to do it, I was always behind anyway. And now I feel very disillusioned with the way medicine is being run. It seems like everyone wants to make a big buck, or if they can't, they'll go somewhere else. So I hope maybe we can speak into this somehow. That's it.
Thank you, Stan. We're so glad you're here. Bill, do you want to go next? Shortly.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Swartley. I'm a nurse anesthetist, and I live in Newton, Kansas. Yes, I remember well, Stan, those days sitting in Franconia on the roost, trying to behave myself on those interminable hot Sunday mornings in the summertime. Those were formative days, I think, for both of us. I'm on the cusp of retirement after a 42-year career in anesthesia, and I've been tremendously blessed by being able to have the opportunity to serve patients and work in this field. It's just been a fabulous career. But along with Stan, somewhere along the line, I caught the justice bug a little bit too, and have always had an eye. Although I haven't done long-term international missions at all, I've done many short-term ones. Actually, been to Kenya. Was in Kenya last May, but I caught that bug, and I have felt a need to find some way to bring some healing and hope, hopefully, to a few people in the third world era countries. One of the reasons I'm interested in this subject is I think sometimes we get so busy focusing on the minutia of the moment and on the challenges that we face pretty much every day with our patients that we serve, that it's kind of easy to sort of forget about the global picture, the mission that all of us really should be focused on. So one of my reasons for being here is to try to continue to keep that in mind as the days go on, as the daily events of the days happen, and try to remember to focus on what the real values are, besides the fact that we're taking care of our patients also, but trying to bring into focus some of the values that we should be holding dear. So.
Thank you. And I realize May may be taking some notes, but I might turn my camera off and find a little scratch paper to jot some of these things down. Thank you, Bill. Jeanette, I know your camera's not on, but we would love to hear from you.
So my name is Jeanette. I am a registered nurse. I live in Pennsylvania. I have experienced critical care, progressive care, home health, and I just got back from living in Haiti, working in a clinic down there. I seen the invitation to this group. Honestly, I don't know anything really about it, so I'm excited to learn today. So I guess I'm new here. Thank you.
Glad you're here. And I'm glad that some of my slides won't be too redundant and may be useful to folks who haven't been involved in a while or haven't yet at all. Claire, would you like to go next?
Yes, hi everybody. I'm sitting in my car in the midst of a torrential downpour here in Cincinnati, and you might be hearing the rain beating down on the roof of my car. I'm in the midst of another project, but I wanted to hook into this. I'm a chaplain here, a hospice chaplain here in Cincinnati. I'm a part of Cincinnati Mennonite Fellowship, and I'm also on the board of MHF. I first became acquainted with the More with Less cookbook tradition and Doris Longacre when I was a young adult living in a voluntary service community in Stratford, Ontario. My goodness, like 45 years ago. And then when the Living More with Less book came out, I devoured that and appreciated it very much. So I've been acquainted with these values for quite some time. I am very happy to see this project get off the ground and looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks for being here, Claire. I love your hat. Very festive.
Yeah.
Elisa Trayer, would you like to go next?
Hi, I'm Elisa. I'm a family doc out in Arizona. I'm actually on call this weekend. So if I haven't met you before, I don't think I've met Emily yet. So I graduated from residency in the midst of the pandemic, July 2020. And so I'm a baby doctor. And I am here looking for a reason to stay in healthcare, kind of. It's just a hard time to be in healthcare in general, and then a hard time for this to like, oh my gosh, is this really what it's going to be like for the next 30 years of my life? Anyway, so I'm hoping that participating in this project will kind of, I guess, give me a ground a little bit more. So the work that I do is kind of the standard, like old timey type medicine. So I work in the clinic, work in the hospital. I have 4 COVID patients that I'm going to go see later this morning, and deliver babies, all that stuff. So it's good work that I like doing, and it's needed. I live in a town of about 10,000 people, for a catchment area of about 50,000 for my hospital. And so it's definitely not the same thing as like developing country medicine, but we don't have a lot of the specialists or easy access to a lot of things that people would have in a larger city. And so it feels like it could be it could be very fulfilling and service oriented if it weren't so exhausting. And so I think one of the things that I'm struggling with right now is how to balance the quality of care that I can provide with the number of patients that traditionally is expected to be seen, so that the idea that I can do better work and make more impact by seeing fewer patients and taking more time, as opposed to the typical way that things have been run, which is like 10-minute visits and just like cramming people in and not necessarily giving them the kind of care that they actually need. And so in terms of the kind of exposure to the 5 Life Standard, I grew up Mennonite. I'm from Harrisonburg, grew up Mennonite, and then kind of since residency or starting residency, there haven't been Mennonite churches or Anabaptist type churches near where I've lived or trained. And so it's been kind of hard to not have that like background support. So in residency, I went to a Presbyterian church, which I think in many ways kind of follows the idea of living simply, but with kind of slightly different like theological background. And then where I am in very rural Arizona, it's like heavily evangelical / Mormon. And so I haven't quite figured out where or like what my church home is going to be here, which has also been a little bit lonely. And so I'm in the process of figuring that out. But in the meantime, I'm hoping that participating in this project will kind of help with developing my community around me, even if it's virtually. And in the meantime, I think I would love to see this MHF project give some hope for especially young doctors that are just getting into, or like young healthcare professionals that are just getting into just a messy healthcare system. I mean, it's always been kind of messy, but I think now just being expected to do so much with so little is different in the quote unquote developed country sort of sense. And yeah, experiencing lack in a not necessarily, it's mostly about personnel now. It's a lack of personnel, not necessary. And I guess in the like last year, like having lack of access to ventilators or other types of things. So just it's a different sort of mindset that I think is going to be with us for a while, whether that's personnel or actual material things that we haven't necessarily had to do in the US. And yeah, and being able to kind of extrapolate those experiences to what that means for our brothers and sisters around the globe is kind of an interesting experience as well. Sorry, that was a lot of talking.
Oh, great. Thanks for being here, Lisa. And I would add to the lacks being, public trust and kind of, I don't know. I don't think I want to go back to the patriarchal ways of medicine where, patients didn't question and didn't have any ownership over their care, but it would be nice to have people trust us when we tell them what as far as science tells us within our expertise. So yeah, glad you're here. Kathy and Mark Shelley.
Hi, I'm Kathy, and we live in Danville, Pennsylvania. That's rural central Pennsylvania for the last 3 years. I am a registered nurse, but not currently working in a healthcare position. My experience with 5 Life Standards has probably been almost ever since the books came out, because I remember when we got married 40 years ago, our friends giving us a copy of the cookbook and marking which recipes were their favorites. And so I grew up in the Mennonite church and have always kind of been around those kind of standards and values as I've grown up, and even in the last 40 years of us being married and being active in a church in Rochester, New York. We currently aren't affiliated with a Mennonite faith community here in central Pennsylvania. And so with what other people have said too, that gets kind of lonely. And, we are part of a church, but it's a UCC church right now. And so we're glad to be connected with MHF. We've been in and out of the annual gatherings over the last 10 to 15 years. And I was on the planning committee a couple of years ago, and good to be here. I'll let Mark introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Mark Shelley. I am an infectious disease physician and work on infection prevention with the Geisinger system. So been a doctor for a long time, been a Mennonite for significantly longer, and I'm definitely feeling the feeling of Mennonite diaspora and trying to maintain some connection to Anabaptism. I actually am unfamiliar. I've never been somebody to look for a cookbook. To that. And when Living More with Less came out, I didn't necessarily read through it, but I am deeply into the general principles. So I'm looking forward to getting to know, probably read this book, get some idea as to how that relates and how that relates to both medicine largely as well as community largely, because I think there are many churches that could use what this book has to offer.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're here. And thank you for your work. I'm sure it's been interesting being kind of in that infectious disease role this past 2 years. What is it now? I don't know. Wanda, I think you're the last person on my list here. If anybody else, if I missed anybody, raise your hand or just jump in after Wanda's done. But do you want to introduce yourself, Wanda?
Right. Can you hear me? I'm never
Yes.
too sure with my laptop. Okay, good. I'm Wanda Tuma McDermott. I'm a professor of nursing at Messiah University, which is physically in Grantham, Pennsylvania, has a different postal address for Mechanicsburg. So we're central PA. We use Harrisburg and multiple systems around there as our clinical sites. And I've been teaching now for almost 20 years, to 18 full-time, I guess. I grew up as a missionary's kid in Zambia, and my vague memories were that my father was part of the original Mennonite Medical Association, because they're, again, looking back on it, these were the people that were in mostly East Coast, EMU Goshen grads, other grads perhaps too, but EMU Goshen grads that were in the East Coast area for med school and needed support. And I'm interested that history is repeating itself to some degree, especially for me. So I graduated from Goshen in nursing, joined Mennonite Nurses Association because there again, I'm Brethren in Christ background, and I knew I wanted this Anabaptist connection in my professional life. So finally, in getting to academics, for me, with Elisa saying, and some of the others of you saying that I am worried about the future and what I'm teaching, and how to teach for hope considering what we've just come through. However, all that to say, the other day, 10,000 Villages was on campus for a Christmas, for Christmas presents, basically. And I happened to be near them, and I couldn't resist getting the newest edition of More with Less, even though I have every other edition. My first edition is probably a public health hazard because similar to Kathy, I got it as a wedding present, and it is so spotted and dirty, but I can't get rid of it. I have it stored carefully. I still have the original Living More with Less. I didn't see it. If I had seen it at TTV the other day, I would have bought it instead of this. But this has impacted my life. And as I said, now I feel my challenge now is how do I present this to students? I do teach, and it's coming up here in the spring, our population community health, public health, kind of population health nursing course. And for years have already focused on social determinants of health, but also bringing in political, ethical determinants of health, and commercial determinants of health. We can go the whole range in this time where it's going to be really, really difficult for them as practitioners. So that's my interest, is that yes, I want some pointers on how to teach for 5 life standards with More with Less.
Thank you, Wanda. And please interrupt me if I missed anybody as we move forward here, but I might backtrack here and say that I do have maybe a little bit of a add-on to the vision for this project that kind of is somewhat personal, I suppose, since I didn't grow up Mennonite, that I really do think that Anabaptist values have a unique, I guess, utility or significance in our day and age for not just healthcare professionals, but society at large. I think it really is something that many people would resonate with. And my hope is that as far as healthcare professionals go, our work would inspire many healthcare professionals who really are struggling, who may not ascribe to these kind of particular faith values or be part of a Anabaptist faith community. So it kind of, I am excited that it will draw people back to their values if that's where they have come from, but also that it is relevant beyond our Anabaptist circles. So I want to breeze through some background information for those of us who are new to the organization or this project, and then really open it up to discussion on the context. And we've gotten a little bit so far, but I want to maybe almost like outline it a little bit better into some of those spheres that we've heard about, whether it's academia or inpatient, outpatient. Hear more about Emily's experience with opening up her own clinic and that how that has gone, or I'm making assumptions, but looking forward to hearing more. So if you're not familiar with MHF, it's a fellowship. So we're focused on being interdisciplinary, coming from Mennonite Medical and Mennonite Nurses Associations in 2011, forming this unified fellowship. And our goals are to provide space for dialogue on health-related issues, talking about how we integrate our faith into practice, and our actions are really through education, advocacy, and service. And so the core functions kind of reflect that mission. So annual gathering is kind of a conference that happens most years. It was virtual this past year. And educational webinars. More recently, we had a podcast, mentorship, both kind of intergenerationally learning from each other, but also across disciplines. And we do support several grants or scholarships to support service opportunities for students and folks who are in practice years. So generally, why did we think that this project was necessary? I think our introductions make that clear. There was an article that we put out a couple years ago in 2018, talking about this concept of the medical industrial complex and these new changes in healthcare that make it so difficult to practice in the way that we came to the profession. So we were all fairly disillusioned, from our training. We came to wanting to help people through this area of expertise. And then the reality is that so many are struggling to find fulfillment in their work and really fulfillment as human beings and the rest and balance that they need. So these slides are from the plenary session. I think there is a recording you can access if you'd like, but there's just a little bit about the medical industrial complex and how we have very little control as healthcare providers many times, and how our workplaces are run and what expectations that puts on us as providers to be sort of a wheel in this machine and to act in certain ways that benefit perhaps the bottom line or whatever the motivators are. It creates some inner dissonance with what we know or believe would be the right thing to do. And so we hear more and more in the news and even in healthcare circles trying to counteract this phenomenon, these concepts of moral injury or moral distress. And the counteraction is usually resilience, and what does that mean, and how do we build that, and how much of it is on the system level versus the provider level. Of course, the pandemic. Yeah, absolutely.
Briefly. One of the things I do a lot of research on also is both patient and provider spiritual struggle and spiritual distress, which is actually measurable. We can also look at the ways providers actually draw on their spirituality to cope, say with a difficult patient or a morally distressing situation. So they're not the same thing. Moral distress can exist independent of spiritual distress, and spiritual distress or struggle can exist independent of moral distress, but they are often correlated. And we can also look at spiritual distress and depression, and there's often a correlation there. So for providers, like I think every single person on this call who are coming to healthcare with a personal spiritual background and a sense of spiritual calling, that sense of, why is God allowing this to happen to my patients? Where is God in this hospital room? Where is God in this emergency room? Where is God in this pandemic? I think that is another layer of struggle that faith-based providers are facing in this time period that also isn't being addressed well. And needs its own set of interventions. Just kind of our resiliency interventions don't necessarily address spiritual struggle. And I think a lot of providers also feel lost in knowing how to explore that spiritual struggle because their secular colleagues are talking about moral distress perhaps, but again, that's not addressing it. And maybe, medicine is a really secularized environment, and we don't often feel comfortable saying to our supervisors, oh, the thing I'm really struggling with is a sense of spiritual struggle. I'm a chaplain, and talking about that isn't actually popular or comfortable even in chaplaincy departments. And so let alone in nursing departments, let alone in other places. So I think that's another layer to kind of the situation that we're in that I think is really important to acknowledge, especially for faith-based providers.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kate. I look forward to drawing on some of that literature and kind of growing work maybe in this project on that spiritual dimension, lending language and those tools and credibility to it. As we know, the pandemic has only made things kind of more exposed in the spotlight as to how healthcare providers are struggling. And there are these responses to increasing provider well-being and paying attention to that on the systems level. But lately, it seems like it's just too little too late. As MHF, we existed as an organization to offer mutual support, and we have attempted to do that throughout the pandemic through gathering for kind of reflection webinars. Our annual gathering was around the theme of fostering resilience. And now this project really is focused on offering this mutual support. And I really do love that vision of hope. Where can we find hope in how can we still be in this field and find that kind of fulfillment or do our job well? And so like Elisa mentioned, we're kind of at this crossroads of thinking, well, if we're going to stay on this path of being a healthcare provider, how do we do that? Are there more enriching, even if they're, you know, a little more nuanced ways to build a career in healthcare that is in line with our values, and how can we support each other in informing our careers and our life and work based on our values? So the framework, as we all know and have showed our cookbooks or Living More with Less books, is Doris Jensen Longacre's work and those principles that she outlined. And it really is founded on this holy frustration or divine discontentment of North Americans kind of do things in a way that maybe ignores the needs of the global family and global home. And we should be mindful of that and these values of justice. And the standards are called standards because they're more like commitments or values. And so we'll review them here shortly. And just to clarify this caring more with less, I think we'll continue to kind of outline it and discuss it, but we really do want more joyful, rich, and creative lives and work lives, I suppose, in seeking ways to thrive, find meaning and fulfillment in our work, really that alignment with shalom, and less of those kind of toxic things that we've experienced in healthcare lately. And I drew from actually the introduction to the new 30th anniversary edition from Living More with Less, where Melinda Berry kind of introduces the revision. And she says here, what may strike some readers as a leap from the 5 standards to a theology is really a small step. Theology is the formal name we give to our talk about God. A more with less theology, then, is the way we verbalize the connections we make between God's unified presence in the universe and our response to God as we live within the world. More with less theology gives special attention to the ways that economic patterns and systems help or hurt this response to God and all that is around us. So the core, as I've experienced of Anabaptist faith, is really making sure that our lives represent our acknowledgement of God and God's presence, and making sure that it all aligns, that we're not separating our work from our family life, from our faith affiliations. And so this idea of God's unified presence, I found it helpful to see it echoed in a Episcopalian bishop here in understanding God and God's presence. So he says in this article he wrote in 2014 on God, if the word God can be understood to refer not to a being, but to the ground of being in which everything that exists is ultimately rooted, but which comes to self-consciousness only in human beings, then the only way that we can worship that which we call God is by finding the courage to be all that each of us can be, and then by allowing, indeed encouraging others to be all that they can be. And I just thought this kind of sounds like what we try to do as healthcare providers, is use our expertise to the fullest to improve the lives of other people so that they can live more fully into their lives and contexts. So I think these concepts are ecumenical, and that is hopeful. So the format of our project is this consensus building approach to defining what do we mean by 5 life standards as adapted to the healing professions. Where do we apply them? That's what we're starting to do today in our brainstorming, and then sharing our living testimonies and hopefully compiling those into a written resource that can be an inspiration and resource for mutual support for many within MHF, Anabaptist circles, and beyond. So very exciting. We just heard last month, I believe it was, that we were funded to implement this project through the Schowalter Foundation. And so our objectives, similarly to kind of what we outlined more broadly, are to engage the membership, to compile those living testimonies in written or visual or video formats. We're not sure quite where it will go. And we're hoping to possibly theme our annual gathering this coming summer, fall, whenever it falls, as a retreat where we can really focus on some of these standards and some of that story sharing, recording possibly. And we do want to see how we can record these things in a meaningful way that, much like the Living More with Less resource has served as an inspiration to so many folks within kind of household topics, guiding those that decision-making process on various topics. So hopefully will all come to fruition, and it's supported by this generous foundation. So briefly, we'll go over the life standards, and then we'll open it up to discussion as far as the context, the places, the topics that we need to think about applying these to. So doing justice is the first standard, and we've applied it here. I've highlighted it in green. Do justice for the health and well-being of all. The next standard is, we've adapted it as learn from the health wisdom of global communities. Maybe we need to expand this even further, given some of what you've talked about justice and that global health perspective. Nurture people, we've adapted it as nurture all people's health and well-being. And cherish the natural order for healthy bodies, communities, and the earth. And the last one here, non-conform freely to serve, care, and live in the pattern Jesus taught us. And these are certainly not set in stone, so we look forward to continuing to reword them as necessary. So the context, let's shift here to talking about where do we apply these standards to. This is just a list of what the Living More with Less book of living testimonies, how they sectioned out the topics and contexts to which they apply the standards and recruit those living testimonies. And many of them probably, there's maybe some healthcare related specific topics that we would want it to duplicate. So for example, money and stewardship, whether you're managing your own practice and how do you manage the resources in that sense, or student loans, that sort of thing. I think some of these might be relevant just the same. And we still, as healthcare professionals, have families and houses and cars or whatever it is. So I've just kind of pasted a few snapshots to get our imaginations going. So whether it's academia, kind of those circles of teams that we work in, that patient provider interaction is very important to us, and our values inform that. Our healthcare record systems, I think this is a snapshot of Epic that we probably aren't too keen on, but how do our values inform our interaction within those systems? How do we contend with, I think this is a huge issue for newer healthcare professionals coming out with lots of debt and needing to secure employment that doesn't necessarily align with our values and our work-life balance aspirations, as far as not feeling like we have to work so hard to pay off these loans, that we can do other things. And we all live somewhere and meet our needs somehow. We might have hobbies that rejuvenate us. We have maybe perhaps children that we choose to engage with in our free time after hours. And do we sign them up for every single sporting activity that we can because we have those opportunities? Or how are we being intentional, given our values, about some of the parenting choices we make, the opportunities that we provide for our children? We may have opportunity to engage with a community of faith, and how do we do that from our particular vantage point? And then as far as leisure time, do we go on every single cruise that we can, or do we try to do some hiking, or what are some of those living testimonies that we can secure of how have people found as healthcare professionals that they can do these things in their life, and that it helps them be a good healthcare provider, and integrating it throughout the spectrum of their life, not just specifically to their work life. So I would like to open it up to discussion, but I want to also, I know that Bill needs to hop off, so maybe we'll give him an opportunity here to speak and share. But next steps in this project today is just brainstorming on those settings or contexts of our work life that we'll apply the standards to. But we will be forming a formal steering committee, or whatever we'll call it, task force, I don't know. But this group that will lead those consensus building sessions to refine the standards, to create that framework of how we go about this project, facilitating those sessions where we share our stories, planning this annual gathering retreat, and then hopefully transcribing some of that shared wisdom into a written resource and exploring a manuscript opportunity. So if you have interest in this project to any degree, we welcome your input on the steering committee. If you know of others whose shoulder you'd like to tap, and send them our way. And we welcome perspectives outside of healthcare as well. So hopefully that gives you a good background to the project and next steps. And I'd love to open it up now and talk about what is our context that we feel the need to apply these standards to, or have already thought through some of these topics and wrestled with them given our Anabaptist values. I realize it's just 2 minutes before 11 when Bill said he has to leave. So feel free, Bill, if you have any comments. I know you, oh, there he is back.
I'm actually going to stick around a little bit longer. This is too good to get to miss.
Oh, wonderful. I'm so glad. All right. Well, maybe I'll leave up this list of and if you have your book, you can look it up on the table of contents. But what do we feel like are the key settings? So, you know, academia is already one, sort of that clinical practice is maybe another. But what are the issues that have come up in our lives that we feel like we really tried to look for those Anabaptist values to ground our decision-making process in?
This is Wanda. Off the top of my head, I was looking at the justice, or our very top one, to justice, or how we formulated it. And I think one of my challenges that I've had in the last X number of years, even teaching at a small liberal Christian liberal arts college, is issues of violence. And I am committed to pacifism and don't expect others to be within my classes, but I would like the respect. And I would like to be able to present things so that students do respect that point of view, because it's a public health. I mean, our violence issue, our firearm, what if the APHA has just recommended we use the term firearm, rather than gun. Firearm issue is that it is a public health issue, and the number of lives lost from it, not just in homicides in urban areas, but also suicides. And presenting that in central Pennsylvania, which has a hunting culture, even with the Anabaptists and the Mennonites and all, your presentation is gun control. We've got to do some sort of gun control at some point in our culture, and presenting that has been very, very difficult over the last several years. But I'm committed to doing it, no matter what it does to my what we call our evaluations and comments students make about how biased I am. I am still going to do this, and I've warned my my department. I will still do this because we say at Messiah that we do incorporate Anabaptism in our creedal policies. I will present this. And so for me, I think that's where my whole background in accepting, like, living more with less and doing justice. That's for me where I think finding for me, this is something that is crystallized and what I will do. Should I finesse it? Yes, I think there are ways to finesse it, and I'd be open to any suggestions of how to present this a little bit better for students' sake. But I think what I'm trying to say is, for me, I think you're talking and asking for examples of where real life, what do we do with this in real life? And for me, that is one area that I have decided to do in my real life.
I love that so much, Wanda. I think there's like so many threads here. I think just the thread of thinking about, as Christian, as Anabaptist health professionals, recognizing that firearm violence, gun violence probably needs to be a part of how we are speaking out. As we think about this project, how is that a part of the public health piece that we hold? But then on top of that, I hear you giving a really powerful example, Wanda, of standard number 5, non-conform freely. And so, like, right there, it's non-conform freely, but also for the health and well-being of others, for your students, as well as for those who are impacted by firearm violence. And so there's sort of two really beautiful threads there of how do we incorporate thinking about gun violence as a public health issue in this project, but also this example of non-conforming freely because of your faith, because of your values, which I love.
On that issue, Wanda, we could also learn from the wisdom of the world community. When I was in Tanzania, it was no one had guns, nobody except the police. And we were able to maybe get a gun to go hunting, but wow, it's just such a contrast. So we could learn from the world community there.
So I have my own practice, but another intriguing part of my life is that my husband works for one of the major health insurance companies in the United States. And so frequently on my days off, when I'm hanging around the house, when he's frustrated about something, I hear about the inner workings of how health insurance works and how, of course, number one is not on their list at all, and how we see the interconnectedness of everything that happens, and yet the motivations and the goals of that group are so distant. And the people who are making those decisions, of course, are not people who know what's going on. I mean, it's all about what money gets paid to the shareholders and what they can report at the end of the quarter. And so I have lots of frustration with that, but I also appreciate being able to see what's going on so that I'm very grounded in what that reality is. And it's interesting that I can have conversations with my husband about things and say, well, what about this? And what about this? And have you thought about this? And then 2 or 3 weeks later, we'll have a conversation where he says, so I was talking with these people and they didn't like what I had to say because I said this and this and this, from a conversation that he and I had. And it's not making a huge amount of difference, but it's interesting. And so I would be really excited and interested about how to make these life standards go even farther than beyond the walls of Mennonite and Anabaptist groups, about how to introduce these concepts broader. And, that is, that's probably more than we can handle. But if there can be some influence there of saying maybe, your goals of life are not exactly what is healthy for the US healthcare system and what is healthy for the world, maybe somebody would stand up and take notice.
Yeah, and I realized that the Living More with Less guidebook, I guess, Home Economics Bible is more an individual family unit type of perspective, and it does kind of go into church level as well. But maybe as healthcare professionals, we don't need to replicate it on that same level as I'm an individual healthcare provider, and here's how I apply my values into my work and life. Yeah, that's just kind of a Western bias, I suppose, this individualistic perspective on I have a choice, because we don't. The healthcare systems are too strong. We don't really have that much of a choice. So maybe one way to contextualize applying these standards is trying to come up with these issues that we come upon. So the way healthcare is financed would be one of them, perhaps, or maybe we even make gun violence or firearm violence one of the topics, because it has become so important. So that's the kind of one thought that comes to my mind is, it might be too audacious and maybe not as productive to unify individual perspectives and ways that people have found their way, but maybe talk more about these global issues, including, student debt or things like that. I want to answer, Mark was asking where this graphic comes from, and I love this postcard, and May has also actually initiated a request to use this graphic in our project and publications or whatever. It comes from the Syracuse cultural workers. I'm including the link in the chat here, and they do have a poster and a postcard, I think, of this image. But yeah, they were inspired by Doris Jensen Longacre's standards to create that. So if you're interested, I put the link in the chat box.
I was impressed with that the ball and the chain hanging on one of the as a representative of the debt. I grew up in the 60s and went to med school in the 60s, and we had grants. I think half of my professors were paid by the government, and I got through med school with $1,000 debt, and no wonder I could be available to do things, to volunteer. And I think this is so big a thing on our kids that come through now, or med students. I mean, they got to make money, and I don't know. I think MMA back then, we tried to give money to help people pay their debt while they're going overseas to do some service, and we'll pay the monthly payments and things. But it is getting way out of here. So we got to do something systemically. I don't know how you do it, but get Washington to start I don't know, helping. I mean, in the context of the poor getting poorer and the rich, the gap getting huge now between the two, it's really hard to change this. But it just seems like a systemic thing that has really afflicted physicians.
Well, and the amount of debt is what I think drives people to choose specialties that pay more. And so you end up, or they choose not to take people that can't pay, like Medicaid or that sort of situation. That's to intentionally choose a job that aligns with a lot of these standards means that you will be in debt for the rest of your life a lot of times, unless there are certain situations that allow you to do like public service loan forgiveness or that sort of thing, but it's not necessarily that cut and dry. It's very difficult, and I think that that's part of why people end up choosing more lucrative careers. And my goodness, like I tell people, do not go into medicine if you think you're going to make money. There are way easier ways to make money than to become a doctor. So I think that that's part of the complicated nature of student debt. But I would say that, so one of the things that I think would be helpful, and I'm not sure whether it would go into nurturing all people's health or cherishing the natural order, would be the acknowledgement that we need to take care of ourselves as providers. And I think using Jesus example, that he wasn't out all day, every single day healing people, that he needed to get away to be with his Father, I think is one way to kind of draw it, that I think that I was interested. I was talking with one of my coworkers recently that's been working in the at this clinic for 20 years. And she's like, I just don't understand like why people like they don't commit to this lifestyle. Like my mom like was a doctor forever, and she was like one of the first female physicians, and she sacrificed so much for herself and her family, like to get female doctors to be at the position now. And so why do so many women want to work part-time and like, think that they need to have a life outside of medicine? I'm like, what are you saying? Like, what in the world? And so I feel I'm like tired of feeling guilty for not wanting to work 60 hours a week. And so like somehow making that okay. And I mean, and learning how to set boundaries and then defend them, because that's the only way that I can stay healthy as a person and continue to give good care. Because when I'm working that much, like I don't give good care. I'm snippy. I like have very little empathy. Like I'm not a good doctor when I work that much. And so I think that it's still part of the medical education system, I think, is to like essentially kill yourself. That's this hero complex type thing, that it's so exalted that you work so much. And yeah, I somehow to push back on that. And again, I'm not sure whether that's in the nurturing or cherishing natural order, that like, that's not what human beings are meant to do. And so somehow providing some sort of support, whether that's like guidelines or advice on how to approach those conversations with employers, and like different wording or that sort of thing. That I mean, I just a couple of days ago, I finally sat down with my scheduling people and the office manager, and I was like, look, I can't keep seeing the same number of people. I'm a baby doctor. I haven't been here for 35 years. It takes me longer to do things. And like, I am never going to be on the productivity wheel. Like, that's not me. I don't care how much money I'm making, as long as I can pay down my debt and I can be happy doing what I'm doing. Like, it just doesn't matter to me. And so but somehow figuring out, like, that's obviously not what like your employer particularly wants to hear, but being able to somehow come up with a compromise that allows you to keep taking care of yourself, having time to be restored, and still be able to meet some of the expectations, or set expectations that you will be able to meet. I think that's one of the blessings of being where I am, is that once I finally like set those boundaries, they're like, oh, okay. And that's because I'm in a private clinic that is not owned by a massive healthcare system, that it's possible. I think it's much more difficult to do in a larger system, but I'm sure there are some ways that we can provide that type of boundary. And that's very specifically in a physician sort of standpoint. I'm guessing like any sort of kind of top tier quote unquote provider, like maybe like dental work, that sort of thing. I don't know what the situation would be for like nursing or that sort of thing, especially because right now nurses are the the limiting factor in how many patients we can take care of in the hospital. And so I don't know that whole situation. But yeah, I think that would be an important point to work in somewhere. And maybe it's not non-conforming, or it's sort of kind of tied in through everything, but being able to take care of ourselves as providers.
And it kind of makes me think of the global wisdom of other communities. We live in a capitalist society that just kind of ruins everything, including healthcare and being a healthcare provider. So
Mhm.
how do other societies approach this and kind of hold that humane balance a little better than maybe the Western capitalist
Yeah.
society does?
And I think some of the guilt comes from, if you don't see them, they're not going to get care. And so like this
Scarcity.
constant tug on your well-being, and knowing that if you don't see 25 patients a day, 30 patients a day, that means someone isn't going to be seen that day, which, I mean, there's got to be a better way to figure that out. And again, that balance of, if I can see fewer patients and like make sure that they understand what I'm saying, like better quality care when you see them. You probably don't need to see them as often or this many people, but I mean, that was like one thing that my coworker brought up. It was like, well, if you cut back, that means they're not going to get care, which is like, well, then I'm not getting care. But yeah, and I don't know the answer to that, but I think is part of the conversation to think about, and what I'm looking for as well, to be able to have conversations with people that get it, at least a little bit more.
So Lisa, your comments are the reasons that I went and started my own practice, that I couldn't handle anymore seeing patients in short periods of time and being pushed to see more and more. And so in my practice, I work part-time, and I, of course, limit the number of people I see a day, and a normal visit is much longer than 10 minutes. And I hope that my patients are better cared for because I can spend more time with them. Also realizing that then I don't have the freedom to do lots of other things, and I'm not making money. I'm still paying off my student loans, and I'll be paying them off till I retire probably. But my other thought was, we talk about medical school and the debt. I'm a DO, and in the osteopathic world, we've been starting medical schools left and right to try to help with the primary care shortage that's been anticipated. And so it would not be beyond the realm of possibility to find someone who'd be interested in starting an Anabaptist medical school. We could do it better with less resources and lots of great healthcare providers that are in our sphere, and who would be, it could be possible to do something and make something happen that would help people be able to graduate with much less debt or zero debt, with the mission of, serving the world. So I don't know that's probably a bigger question than this group, but that could be one way to fix that problem for a lot of our members who would love to go into medicine, but see so many walls to surmount in that process.
I think Wanda's volunteering to be a faculty at that institution.
No, I was going to comment on kind of what Lisa had been saying about, about feeling guilty. Maybe a little bit of a nursing perspective. Okay, here's a vignette. Recently, our nursing department had a meeting with a local DONs and others in our systems. And one of the things that came out was, well, nurses don't know how to do sterile wound care. And, that's part of our problems with HAIs, and all our infection control. And I really resented that remark, because I'm like, okay, I know what I do and the time I have to teach wound care. It's not as if we don't teach it. And what I have often wondered is, if you are so busy and so rushed that you can barely do a good job, and especially when it comes to a sterile wound dressing, is that the nursing professor's fault, or is that the systemic fault where you have not hired enough people? And that's where I'm going with all this so many times. That nurture all people's health and well-being. And in nursing, we have research out there from Dr. Linda Aiken at the University of Pennsylvania. This is not, a nobody, who has had years and years of research, and she's basically said, if you have enough people to do the job, they will do a good job. They will, you decrease your failure to rescue. They pick up on signs and symptoms and get people care faster. They hear the lung sound. You have fewer. You prevent infections because you have enough people to take the time to do a sterile dressing properly because they have been taught it. You have enough people who get their breaks and their meals, and they feel better about doing care. Like you said, if you've been working too long, you really feel mean and nasty. And how to get management types to see that it's your upstream thinking that if you have enough people to do the job, they will do a good job, and you will probably prevent a lot of these problems that you're struggling with at the moment. And so I'm back to getting a little testy in my old age, because in our program, we teach self-care almost continuously. I'm not sure that we model it well as faculty, and I'm not sure that we are kind enough to the students to model it well. We just tell them to do self-care, and then we add another assignment and another assignment and another assignment, and then we wonder why they're anxious and yeah. Anyhow, so I'm kind of back to where are we going to kind of stop this and have enough people to do a good job. I mean, I'll continue to teach about self-care and sterile wound dressings and sterile technique. It's all back to kind of aseptic and sterile technique also. But at what point do we nurture all people's health and well-being? Where do we cherish the natural order for health? Where does somebody within the system of power in the administration and management start making the changes too?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question that it's almost like we need to distinguish between like messages toward people who have power and then how to function in the current system as it is. And acknowledging that the current system is not ideal, but it's what we have currently. And like how to accept your humanity while knowing that you're probably going to be asked to do more than you should. Like accepting that reality and not necessarily being satisfied with it. And I'm because I think that a book that's solely focused on like how we could make this in an ideal world isn't necessarily going to be as useful, but having like a vision for this is how it could be, and then here's how we can keep going in the meantime would be helpful. Because I mean, I know in my like very cynical my cynical viewpoint would be like, oh yeah, that's great, and what do I do now? Like, yeah, how do I, like, in this situation where I currently am, what am I supposed to do with this? And so having like, small steps that we can take, like talking with my supervisors, like this is what I need, while acknowledging that that's like, we're still in an imperfect world that expects, a certain amount and is still dealing with like insurance companies. But yeah, having like a vision, this is what it could be. This would be the like more ideal, while acknowledging that we're asked to do more with less. But yeah, how to still be able to take care of ourselves and take care of people in the meantime. And this is something, I have a friend that's working in Papua New Guinea right now, and like in a different sort of way, like they have just said, like, we see as many patients as we possibly can between these hours, and then after that, like that's that. Like we have to still be able to take care of ourselves, and because we're in this for the long haul. And yeah, if you're burnt out and you can't function, then no one's going to get care. So yeah, even in like very resource poor settings, like they still find a way to set boundaries.
Seems to me that there's, and it's almost like there's two different ways to come at this. One is to come at it and say, well, how do we need to change the whole friggin' system? And speaking truth to power and changing all that is above us and making it work out right. Or to take a look at it and say, well, we'll just be the quiet doctors in the land, or quiet healthcare providers in the land. And thinking that we maybe have more opportunity to change our local environment and to act in our local way than necessarily. And I guess that takes me to the last point of non-conforming freely. We realize that the system that we live and work in is not just in many ways, because if it was a perfect, just system, we would not need to non-conform. We have different values than the C-suite, and so I think this isn't an either or. I think it's a both and. I value the idea of speaking truth to power, to hold up justice, and I'm currently trying to just figure out how to say that more nicely in the end, because I found out that just speaking truth to power with a harsh voice doesn't get you anywhere. He certainly doesn't get you heard, because there's that mute button. Anyway, I'm just looking at the tension between those two things and trying to ask the question, how are the little decisions that I make that I can be satisfied with, that relate to non-conforming freely, that will ultimately show the example for others? Oh, you can survive, you can be in a good place. So we have to have both ideas, the Menno Simons School of Medicine and the choice we made of how we spent 2 hours this Saturday.
No, thank you for making that distinction, Mark. I was thinking, when Elisa was saying kind of the people with the power, and then sort of us who don't always have the power, and maybe we do have an opportunity to be the decision makers or those with power, but I suspect it wouldn't be quite as easy to implement some of our idealist hopes for kind of the optimal way of doing things, even if we did have the power. It's just a complex system, no matter what level you are at. And so I'm thinking the way that the Living More with Less testimony book is structured, they have these chapters on topics, and they have appointed one person to write kind of an introduction to the topic. So I'll scroll back. So the one, for example, technology and media, I kind of skimmed through that one. It talked about just the challenges, sort of the problem. That's kind of the opening thesis of here's the issues with technology and media in modern society and how they're dissonant with some of the values of Anabaptist communities. And then they go into living testimonies of how people have struggled with this and possibly found little ways to make the best of those opportunities in that context. And so that could be one way to kind of blend that speaking truth to power, maybe framing the issue, and how Anabaptism responds to that issue, and then compiling these living testimonies of people who have found those little ways to find hope and really live into a different narrative within their realm of influence. I'm curious to hear about autonomy, like provider autonomy. I know that's kind of a struggle with the bigger systems that have uniform ways of providers doing things. But especially those of you who kind of are towards the end of your practice life, have you gotten a sense of how that's changed over time? And is autonomy this like magical object that young providers have in mind that maybe didn't ever exist, or did you really get to make your own decisions as providers?
Well, in the anesthesia world, nurse anesthetists are so-called mid-level providers. And our frustration primarily is the fact that the anesthesiologist society or societies or world, in the United States at least, is always very obstructive when it comes to nurse anesthetists expanding their ability to practice independently. And in the rural areas of the United States, like 80% of anesthetics are provided by nurses, not by physicians. And so, and the reality is, in spite of what the anesthesiologist would like to tell everyone, the reality is that there's really no difference in outcomes between nurses and physicians when it comes to providing anesthesia services, especially in rural areas. Because in rural areas, they're not doing craniotomies and, you know, huge, big congenital open heart surgery repairs and that kind of stuff. They're doing much more simple stuff. And for the most part, those patients do really well, whether their anesthesia is provided by a physician or by a nurse. So I guess my point is that there's a real tension between the physicians and middle practice and healthcare providers, just because of the politics, much more so than the realities of outcomes. The other thing is, I don't know, I've just been looking a little bit at the world health situation. And when we talk about justice and we talk about learning from the world healthcare providers or world healthcare situations are all around, you know, it's so dramatically different. I really like Mark Shelley's comment that we have to recognize that the system is unjust, and it is unjust in the United States, but it's even more unjust in the rest of the world. I mean, Tedros Ghebreyesus, who's the chairman of the World Health Organization, recently said that 1/2 of the world's population does not have access to basic healthcare. That just is amazing to me, that in this modern age, there's still half of the nations, half of the people in the world don't have access to healthcare. That's just amazing to me. And, you know, I don't know, I just was reading that 300,000 or so women have died in resource poor countries in 2020 or 2021, I mean, and 99% of those deaths around maternal issues, these are maternal patients, 99% of those people were in resource poor countries. And talk about justice, that's not justice in my mind. I don't understand how we fix that. I don't know how you do that, but you know, in Africa, well, I know a little bit about the anesthesia world. In Africa, especially in some of the central countries in Africa, there's only one anesthesia provider per 100,000 people. That's a remarkable statistic in my mind. And many of those anesthesia providers are not even particularly well trained, I don't think. I mean, Somalia has 28 anesthesia nurses with varying degrees of training for a nation of 2.5 million. I forget exactly how many people are in Somalia. But I mean, there's just so many countries around the world that are really, really suffering with having no reasonable access to healthcare. In the United States, we have, well, the World Health Organization recommends 30 anesthesia providers per 100,000 people, and only resource-rich nations in the world have that kind of coverage. Every other nation is way below that. Even in countries like Peru, where it's only 1.6 anesthesia providers per 100,000 people. So I don't know what justice looks like in those people. And I recognize that in our country, we have a terrible problem with the unfairness of healthcare, but it's way worse in most resource poor countries in the world. So again, it's a huge issue, and it's very different from what we've been talking about. And I don't know what the answers are, but it continues for me to be an issue of my feeling like in my world, where I earn really big bucks for what I do and way more than I really need, it's totally unjust. And tell me how to think about that. I don't even know how to think about that. It's just very difficult. Okay, didn't mean to stop the discussion.
We're just all sitting with that weight, that's all.
I really appreciate that. And I want to as I think about this project, I want to be able to hold both, and also to say, and as one of the wealthiest nations in the world, our disparities are still really extraordinary. Just talking around maternal issues and birth and infant mortality. I'm most recently from Cincinnati, which is where Claire is, and I suspect that the statistics in Philadelphia are equally dire, but I knew them in Cincinnati because I worked for the Children's Hospital there. Cincinnati has one of the top 3 children's hospitals in the world, and the area right around the hospital has one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world. Like not just in the US, and specifically Black infants and Black mothers died at twice the rate of white infants and white mothers in Cincinnati, which was just shocking. And so how do we respond to this as providers who also are enmeshed in a system? Like I worked for Cincinnati Children's, and I would say that that hospital was a part of the problem, even as they were trying to be a part of the solution. Because even though they were expanding their emergency department, they were destroying the neighborhood and the neighborhood connections and resources as they expanded. There's a reason hospitals build in resource poor areas, because they can buy out people's homes and neighborhoods in those types of areas. And so just some of those issues and what it meant for me to be a provider in that space, and a white provider in that space. There was just a lot of pieces there. And so how do we hold attending to the disparities and health access issues around the world, and also here in the US, where we can't pretend that it's always that much better. It is a lot better. So I don't want to draw a false a false comparison. It's so much better, and yet our system continues to deeply fail, particularly people in US resource poor areas and people of color. And in terms of the project, how do we hold these systemic, I think this has emerged today, really attend to systemic things as well as these personal pieces, the self-care piece, which is huge.
Back
And
in
go ahead. Oh, I was going to say that I really appreciate that. So Brene Brown has talks about comparative suffering and how it's not necessarily helpful, that something being wrong or more wrong, quote unquote, in one place doesn't necessarily mean that the wrong that's wrong, but not quote unquote quite as wrong, is okay, essentially. So I think that that's important, that acknowledging that there are places in the US that the quality of healthcare that is provided is still not appropriate, even if in many other places it's much worse, that it's still not okay for some people to get one quality or one level of healthcare. And yeah, I mean, it's not right, even if it isn't quote quite as bad. While acknowledging that the occasional access to certain levels of healthcare to people that can pay for it in the US is going to be much better compared to places around the world. It really is about whether or not you can pay for it, because I have schizophrenic patients that they're never going to get healthcare that's as good as anyone else around, even if they could potentially pay for it, because they just don't have the same access or understanding. And I mean, essentially the level of care that I'm providing for my patient is the same as I would in Mexico, just because of certain, insurance type situations or whatever. Yeah, I have patients that are having body parts lopped off because they can't afford diabetes medications. And so it's just, I mean, it's not necessarily, the comparative suffering that there is inadequate healthcare in the United States, even in the United States. And I think that it's important to be able to blend that. It's not an either or. I agree, Kate.
Some of us public health types like to think about or call our healthcare system the sick care system, because it's really treating people who usually have preventable things that happen, that are sort of upstream, need to be dealt with, but haven't because of things like systemic racism, poverty, lack of access to prevention, or just decent life situations. And then they end up in front of us, and we're supposed to solve all of those issues and send them back to where they came from, where those issues developed. So I think that has something to do with it, and hopefully we'll have some public health types join in on this discussion in the project. Stan, I think you had a comment to make.
Yeah, during this pandemic, I was impressed by the fact that in the United States, 16% of our people, 16% over 65. And of course, we're the ones that are getting sick mostly, are dying. And in Africa, it's 3% are over 65. So they don't see the effect quite as much as we're. But then I thought, why I feel a little guilty being alive. I'm an old guy now, and I must have been privileged to be able to be alive this long. And so, why should I care if I get hit by COVID and die? Because, it's sort of evening thing out. But anyway, back in the 76, Willard Crable put out a book. He edited a book called Medical Ethics, Human Choices. And he asked me to write a chapter on equality and stuff. So I suggested that maybe before we get our bypass surgery, and then we all have this common insurance. This Mennonite, was it mutual aid, who had a medical insurance, that maybe the people, rather than getting bypass surgery, they shouldn't be paid for that. They should just sell their farm if they think they should have it. And that went over like a lead balloon. And one of the reasons I thought of that is because when I went back to Tanzania the second time, I had a patient that just went into the hospital for a bypass surgery, and the cost of his care equaled the annual budget of our hospital at Sharati. And, so you can't say those types of things because it affects some, I'm living longer because I have a good health care, I guess. So I don't know. But I thought of that recently. I was deciding whether to have shoulder surgery, and I'm not going to do it. I'm an old man, and the old people get pains and they live with them, so that's sort of how it's affecting me right now.
So that's interesting. So I kind of try to have that conversation with my patients at times when the monetary impact of what we're starting to discuss is significant, and is that worthwhile in the big picture. Sorry, I heard an echo and I thought it was someone else talking. But how do you have that conversation with patients about the resources that they're going to be consuming if they decide to have their shoulder replaced, or if they decide that they're going to do whatever that decision is? There's so many high dollar resources that we consume, and having a realistic discussion with patients, especially if they don't come from that same background of understanding that all those resources, even if they're available, are not ours for the taking. That's a challenging conversation to have, but I think could be a helpful way to let people start to think about those values which we hold dear and which we think the world would be better off with if they adopted as well.
It's sort of like when your parents said, now eat everything on your plate because there are people starving in other parts of the world. If I'm going to get, if I, how can I give that food to those other people? If I don't have my bypass surgery, is anybody got a profit other than the insurance companies? Of course, in Medicare, I guess that's a little different, but making these decisions about not to consume medical care doesn't always, it's such a big system that it doesn't say, oh, I won't have my bypass so that guy can have his. It doesn't work that way.
It was interesting in the pandemic to hear the story of the priest from Italy, where it did actually work, where he was in the ICU and was going to be put on the vent at the very beginning of COVID and said, no, I want you to give my vent to the 26-year-old guy beside me. And he died. But that's like the only case that I can ever think of where that theory actually works.
I used to have interesting conversations, and every once in a while I actually get a call from someone in my role here with MHF who has an Amish or conservative Mennonite patient in the hospital here in the US, and they don't are kind of freaking out about what to do. And I had a case once where somebody came to me and said, Kate, I need to consult about this patient. It's a child that needs a heart transplant. And, the internet is very clear that the Amish and Mennonites don't do heart transplants. So are we just at the end of the road? And I was like, first off, the internet is not our authority here. Second off, have you asked the family? And I get a lot of, oh, well, I don't want to offend them. I'm like, please, like, I think 99% of the calls and cases I've had with Amish and Mennonite families, the solution has been ask the family, and then like it's gone fine. But then we had a long conversation about this person was already, so they hadn't asked the family, but then they also were like morally horrified by the fact that because what they read on the internet said this family wouldn't do a heart transplant. And I said, did the internet explain to you some of the pieces there? And a lot of it does have to do with, because conservative communities often don't buy into the US health insurance system, there's actually a deeper consideration of, is this huge use of resources that is going to take resources out of our community? Is that how we want to be using our resources and our time and our money? As a community. Now, in this case, this was an infant that would have had a pretty typical life with this transplant. And so I think the community was like, absolutely, this is something we would do. Whereas I think if it's somebody who's in their 80s, maybe the community wouldn't. And so there's that sort of actual consideration of cost benefit analysis, which I think, while I am generally a proponent of single payer systems and kind of, I also think that the ways our system is set up, it distances us so much from the real cost of what we're consuming, that I appreciate in some ways those communities that actually bear those costs in a different way, and so have to think about what that means and what that looks like. And I also appreciate it when physicians just ask their patients their questions before calling me in a panic.
I was going to rather facetiously add that when COVID struck, I used our family WhatsApp and texted and said, do not put me on a vent. Save it for somebody younger, because we were real. I mean, I'm literally looking at things in the way they're going, and I'm thinking, I'm old enough, I've lived well. And MHF also had a discussion around that time, if some of you might remember, where others came and said, yeah, we're old enough, we don't need the vents, save them for somebody younger. So it's on the family WhatsApp, it's still there. Now, the problem is the oldest son, who is a lawyer, said, that's not going to hold up. It's on the family WhatsApp. It's not written anywhere. I said, yeah, but I can't get to the will, or I can't get to a lawyer to change my will in these circumstances, because we've just headed into a pandemic and we're all in shutdown. This is, in a sense, this is my end of life declaration. And then the son, who's a physician, said, well, I'm not going to, that doesn't mean anything either. So that was my end of life approach to COVID, and a lot of good it did me, apparently. But I still mention that I do the end of life care content in our curriculum, since I've had what's called LNEC training. And I mentioned that to students, but I said at some point we do need to think about this. What do we want for our end of life care? Where do we want to go with palliative care versus hospice care? Versus things that are very, very expensive. So.
Isn't there some statistic out there about the last 6 months of someone's life is where the majority of their healthcare dollars are spent? And so I think that those conversations are really important in this context.
I will add, there's some really interesting research by Tracy and Michael Balboni at Harvard that more folks who test through surveys that they're more religious and particularly more evangelical have higher end of life costs than the general population, and often higher end of life pain and less use of hospice, and are a significant source of cost at the end of life in the American healthcare system. And that has always been a really interesting finding to me, because I am a huge proponent of integration of faith, religion, and health in healthcare. I want it to be a factor that we think about, that we talk about. I want people to be able to bring their full faithful selves into their healthcare situations. And yet I don't want people to die in pain and to use up resources in that space. And so that's an interesting one for me. And how do we think about that as Christians?
So I put in Kate in my email, and feel free to put yours as well. I think we're enjoying the discussion with each other and may want to send particular inquiries. And so yeah, happy to record your emails. I'm sure we can find them through the Zoom registration as well. And maybe May has like a attendance thing going or something, but I see that we're down to our last 7 minutes here of the scheduled session, and want to just remind us of the next steps. We are coming upon the holidays here, which is a bit time when people tend not to pay attention to their inboxes and have trouble making it to meetings and such, which is good. Hopefully you have that time to rest and celebrate. So come January, we will start kind of shoulder tapping and convening the committee. If you already know you'd like to be part of the active components of this project, we welcome you to send a message already to Kate and me. And if you have other people to send our way that you think would offer even one of these topics, if you feel like they could be a content expert, we'll identify them at some point, but if you already know about them, send them our way as well. I think our first working committee meeting will be sometime in February, and we really will try to flesh out how the framework for what are the steps that need to take place for this project to come to fruition. Some of these 2 sessions, we've already kind of gotten somewhat of a vision for what this will look like in reality, but we'll continue to flesh that out. So I also want to welcome Dr. Dodadim from Guatemala, if I'm remembering correctly. We're glad that you joined us for some of the session. And in our last 5 minutes here, let's finish out with our fellowship. And thank you so much again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
I'm glad to be here. Sorry to be so late, but I have an emergency to attend, but I'm really glad to hear some of the discussions.
I want to emphasize, although we haven't sat down and said this is exactly what the 5 Life Standards Steering Committee will look like, it is my hope that less than a church council style meeting, that group will be sitting down and really having similar discussions to what we've been having today. We will also continue to have sessions like this that are wide open to anybody to attend, and will be focused on the different standards, but within the committee, really a more intensive space for those of you that are saying, oh, I really want to take time this year to have these conversations. That being a part of that group, I'm not loving the word committee. I love the word, I love being in groups, but the group that gathers around this to really be a more intensive space to have these conversations, build the relationships with one another. But we'll also continue to have these open conversations. So there's a lot of levels with which to get involved. And I do know we hope for an international perspective, as well as US. This learn from the world community, learn from global communities, I think is so important as well.
And just in regards to the recording, I know May has been taking some notes of today's session to glean some of those nuggets, and our recording will be on file on Kate's computer, as I understand, and there has been a request to circulate that to folks on the call, but our intention is not, as I understand, to post it publicly. Is that correct?
What I can do is we do have a YouTube channel, and the way that I post things there is that they can't be searched and found, but that just it's an easy way to share a video. And so I can send the link. I will upload this to that private channel, and I can share the link with all of you. So you shouldn't need a password to watch the replay of this session, but somebody can't just search it out. And so you'll need that link to find it.
And I can also attach the slides from today's session too for your reference. Well, again, thank you each for taking the time this morning. I think this project continues to gain momentum, and it's very exciting to see others join on in, and stay tuned. Hopefully see some of you or all of you in our committee work, and certainly when we convene to share those stories.
Well, thank you, Lubov and Kate, for facilitating this conversation too and moving this forward.
It's been a pleasure.
Great to see each of you. Have a wonderful rest of your Saturdays. And if we don't see you before the holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Advent, and Happy New Year.
Bye.
Happy New Year. Merry Christmas.